All right, the next component we're going to implement is the badge component. As you can see here, we have variations of badge components. So we have large badges and small badges. And also in terms of color, we have these badges that are in light blue and this other badge that is in medium blue. So this is where we're going to apply object-oriented CSS principles. We talked about this in the second part of the series. So the second principle of object-oriented CSS says that we should separate structure from skin. So we're going to define two different classes here. One class to give this the basic structure in terms of the padding and font size. Then we're going to define a few other classes to give this element different skins, like different colors and different sizes. So in our style sheet, let's add a new section and say badges. Good. So first we're going to define the structure. We're going to call this class badge. I'm going to set the border radius to 20 pixels. Again, here I'm using an absolute value because I don't want this radius to be dependent on the font size. Now for padding, I'm going to use half a rem for vertical padding and 2 rems for horizontal padding. And of course, you can use any values you want. As I was experimenting with these values, I thought these values are closest to what we see in our design mockup. Next, we're going to set the font weight to bold because all our badges have a bold font. And finally, I'm going to set white space to no wrap. This prevents a badge from wrapping into a second line. This is particularly important when we have limited space. For example, let's say we have a small card and we have limited space for our badge. We don't want this badge to wrap into a new line. Whatever we put inside this badge should always appear in a single line. So using this property, we can disable wrapping. So this is the structure. Now let's define a skin. So this is where we're going to use the BEM naming convention, block element modifier. So using 2 hyphens, we separate a block or a component from a modifier, like primary. So here we're going to use our primary color. So we set the background to var color primary and the text color to white. We're going to define another skin for the secondary color. So we set the background to color secondary and the text color to white. Now to test this, let's go back to index.html and add a span with 2 classes, badge and badge -- primary. And for the label, we can say 10% off. That's not working. Well, looks like I made a mistake and here I should have used 2 hyphens. Good. Now, one thing that is really off for me here is the weight of the font. So I set the font weight to bold because here we have the bold version of Inter font. But when we see this in the browser, this bold font looks a little bit too thick. Now back to index.html, this is where we're loading this font from Google. So currently we're loading this font in 2 different styles with a weight of 400 and 700. What if we add 600 here as well? Well, first I thought we're going to get an extra font file, but then I did some experimentation. Let's fire up DevTools, go to the Network tab, and refresh the page. Look, we have a single font file. So even though we are requesting 3 different styles of this font, we have a single font file. How is this happening? Well, here on Google Fonts, I read the documentation of the Inter font. Look over here. Inter is a variable font family. These variable fonts are newer and allow us to store multiple styles of a font inside a single font file. But because they are somehow new, we don't have a variable version of every font out there. So for the most part, when we request different styles of a font from Google or other font services, we'll end up downloading multiple font files. But if a font is a variable font file, we'll get a single file no matter how many styles we request. So that means we can request other styles without increasing the size of this page. So back to our badge, I'm going to change the font weight from bold, which is 700, to 600. That looks better, it's more readable, but the font is a little bit too large. Here in the mobile version of our design, look at the font size of this badge. It's 20 pixels, but our body text is 24 pixels. So for normal badges, I want to use 2 rems for the font size, and then I'm going to create a separate skin for small badges, and there I'm going to use 16 pixels or 1.6 rems for the font size. So back to the badge class, let's add font size 2 rems. And as I told you before, we should do our best to keep these properties sorted. This makes our code more readable. So we bring up the command palette and sort lines in ascending order. Much better. So this is for our normal badges, and here's what we get that's closer to our design mockup. Great. Now let's create a separate skin for small badges. So another class, badge dash dash small. And here I'm going to set the font size to 1.6 rems. Now to test this, we go back to our markup and apply a second class here, badge dash dash small. Take a look. That looks great. Now the beauty of this approach, the beauty of object-oriented CSS is that we can combine these classes in any way we want to produce different results. Maybe somewhere I want a secondary small badge. Maybe somewhere else I want a primary small badge. Here's what we get. Maybe in another place, we want a primary badge that is not small. We simply remove this class. And here's what we get. So we're done with the mobile version. Now we need to adjust the font size for larger screens. So right here, we're going to write another media query and say for screens that are wider than 1024 pixels. For our badge class, we're going to set the font size to 1.5 rems. And for small badges, we're going to set the font size to 1.2 rems. 1.2 rems. Good. So let's test it real quick. Here's the mobile version and here's the desktop version. Great. So we're done with this component. Now, just like before, I want to save a copy of this markup in the components folder. So copy. Now in the components folder, we create a new file called badges.html and we paste it here. We could also paste other examples like primary, secondary, and primary with a small badge. That also works. So we're done with this task, and now it's time for what? For committing our code into our repository. I'll let you do that, and I will see you in the next lesson.